Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week's rabbit hole explores whether the sages of the Talmud knew about radio waves and how gremlins communicate over long distances. But, as always, we have to get there. So first, before I start, an apology. This week's episode is super late. It's already the end of the week, and I'm really sorry about that. I've been working on a project for Purim, and it's been just really hard to juggle everything. The good news is that the Creative Judaism Purim Technical Support Hotline is up and running. Are you having trouble getting out of your giant inflatable costume? Would you like to be put on hold? Then call us now at 812-57-PURIM. That's 812-577-8746. Okay, so that took a lot of time, and I wasn't even going to do a Parshah Rabbit Hole this week. But a few dedicated viewers actually reached out and asked if there was a Parshah Rabbit Hole this week, and when I told them no, they expressed a lot of disappointment. So I'm doing it, but I'm doing it rushed, and I'm doing it late. Okay, let's get started. This week's Torah portion, Parshas Vayikra, tells us all about the sacrifices brought in the Mishkan and eventually in the temple. I had some trouble figuring out what direction I wanted to go with this originally, and I had a few animal sacrifice related threads that I spent some time digging into, seeing where they would lead. But eventually I decided to focus on the first word of the Torah portion, Vayikra, which is also the name of the Parsha and the name of the entire book of Chumash, known in English as Leviticus, but the real name is Vayikra, and it means called. Hashem called to Moshe. So, since I had telephone calls on my mind because of the Purim thing I told you about, I decided to take this idea of calling and think about it in the context of telecommunication. And when I started thinking about that, I remembered hearing a long time ago that there's a Gemara that supposedly alludes to the existence of radio broadcasts 1,500 years before that technology even existed.
And here's the winning number on the sweepstakes, folks!
So that's where this week's rabbit hole starts, with trying to find unexpected instances of telecommunication in Torah. If you're ready, let's dive in. Okay, let's start with the alleged radio Gemara. This is what it says. The rabbis of the Mishnah taught in a brisa that there are three sounds which travel from one end of the earth to the other. They are the sound of the sphere of the sun, the sound of the crowds of Rome, and the sound of the soul leaving the body when a person passes away. The Gemara continues that some say also the sound of a baby being born, and then some say also the sound of ridya. Okay, so there are a lot of interesting things there, and I'll probably get back to them in a future rabbit hole, especially the sound of the sun, because there's some cool stuff about that. But for now, let's focus on ridya. According to this Gemara, there are sounds that can travel from one end of the world to the other, and one of them is ridya. That sounds like a pretty good description of radio.
Coincidence?
And ridya is not a word that translates to anything. It's a name of something. Rashi explains that ridya is the name of an angel. Specifically, the angel in charge of irrigation and making sure that everything on earth gets enough water. So that kind of puts a wrench in the whole radio thing. But Rashi lived 1,000 years ago, so maybe the Gemara is talking about radio, but Rashi would have had no way of knowing that, so he explained it the best way he could based on his own frame of reference. Right? Maybe that could work and we're back in business. But there's a letter from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that debunks this idea pretty strongly. Someone wrote to the Rebbe asking about the possibility of this Gemara referring to radio, and this is what he answered. It's impossible to interpret the Gemara this way, because the term radio in reference to these waves is just something that the people who discovered it decided on. But that word is not dictated by the nature of the waves themselves. They didn't have to be called that. They could have been called something else, and in fact they were. For the first 20 years or so after they were discovered, radio waves weren't called radio waves, they were called Hertzian waves, named after Heinrich Hertz, who proved that they existed. So, first of all, this is kind of a bummer, because it would have been really cool if the Gemara was talking about radio waves thousands of years before scientists discovered them. But there is something cool about this answer for me, which is that it gives us some interesting guidelines for dealing with this type of thing. Every once in a while, things like this pop up, where there's some viral Yalkut Shimoni going around that mentions TikTok or something like that.
It's a sign. It's an omen.
It's a coincidence, Dad.
And for the people who do get really excited about those kinds of things, please stay very excited. I don't want to take that away from you. But I personally don't. So for me, that letter from the Rebbe gives me a nice way of articulating why. Because lots of words have developed over the past 2,000 years, and eventually we're going to end up combining sounds that have already been combined in other languages. It's actually called a false cognate, and it happens all the time. But it also gives me a good way to determine when I should get excited. If the word in Gemara or Midrash clearly must be referring to this modern thing because that thing could never have been called anything else. I can't think of any specific examples of that right now, but if any of you can, please share that in the comments. Okay, so even though I found a reason why making that Gemara not be about radio is still cool to me, it's still kind of a downer. But that's why I'm going to share this next Gemara with you. It's dealing with the concept of Tchum Shabbos, the maximum distance a person is allowed to travel on Shabbos. And the question they're exploring is whether there's a height limit for this law, specifically 10 tfachim, which is kind of around 3 feet. So the question is, if a person travels on Shabbos, but they're traveling 3 feet off the ground, does the maximum distance still apply? But in order to discuss this, they need to come up with some scenarios where people are flying. This is what it says. It mentions a known case where a certain teaching was taught before Rav Chisda in Surah on Shabbos morning, and then before Shabbos ended, that same teaching was taught before Rava in Pumbedisa. So somehow this information traveled from one city to another on Shabbos. But these two cities, Surah and Pumbedisa, are definitely way beyond the Tchum Shabbos from each other, and they're also far enough away from each other that it would have been humanly impossible to travel from one to the other in a single day, unless you can fly. So the Gemara says, who was it that brought this teaching from Surah to Pumbedisa on Shabbos? The only logical conclusion is that it must have been Eliyahu Navi, or Elijah the prophet, who's no longer bound by the laws of physics and could fly from one city to another. But he's still Jewish. So this must be a proof that if you can fly 3 feet off the ground, then the Tchum Shabbos, the maximum distance you're allowed to travel on Shabbos, isn't a problem. But then the Gemara says, no, this isn't a good proof, because there's somebody else who could have brought this information, and that's Yof Shada. Now, for those of you who don't know, Yof Shada, or Yosef the Gremlin, is a gremlin that was friends with the sages of the Talmud and would help them out with stuff. I'll almost certainly get back to him in a future rabbit hole. But for now, what's relevant is that the Gemara sees Yosef the Gremlin as an alternative way that this information could have traveled on Shabbos. The way Rashi explains it, Yosef the Gremlin doesn't keep Shabbos, and he can fly. So he flew from Surah to Pumbedisa on Shabbos to deliver this information from one yeshiva to another, which is pretty nice of him. But Or Zerua, in the name of his teacher Yehuda HaChassid, offers another way to explain this. He says that Yehuda HaChassid said that gremlins do keep Shabbos. In fact, he said that gremlins believe in the entire Torah and follow all of the words of the rabbis. So then his students asked him about this Gemara, which seems to imply that Yosef the Gremlin was able to fly from one city to another on Shabbos because he doesn't keep Shabbos. So Yehuda HaChassid answered that that's not what the Gemara is talking about there. The logic of the Gemara there wasn't that Yosef the Gremlin flew there on Shabbos and he was allowed to because he's a gremlin. No, the Gemara wasn't even talking about flying. According to Yehuda HaChassid, this is what it was describing. A situation where there's one gremlin in Surah and Yosef the Gremlin in Pumbedisa. And the gremlin in Surah uses a long hollow tablet to speak to Yosef the Gremlin, who then relayed the information to Rava. And there was never any doubt that gremlins keep Shabbos. So, okay, a lot of interesting stuff here. But let's focus on the most exciting part, which is that according to this, gremlins had some sort of telecommunication network back in the time of the Talmud, which is very cool. And even just the fact that the Or Zerua described something like this in the 1200s is pretty wild. A long hollow tablet, I don't even know what that could be comparable to in the 1200s. So this rabbit hole has given us some good news and some bad news. The bad news is no radio in the Talmud. The good news is maybe gremlin telephones? I actually had a lot more cool stuff to share about this topic, but as I explained earlier, I had to cut this one short because I was working on the Creative Judaism Purim Technical Support Hotline. But if you want to do some extra digging on your own, there's a very cool video from JEM, Jewish Educational Media, about how the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Farbrengens were broadcast over telephone in the 70s, and I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. Alright, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you can't find your way out, maybe try calling for help on a long hollow tablet.